Hi everybody, just before we get started, a quick note. Amy and I had a really busy January, the both of us, so we didn't actually have a chance to sit down and do a recording session over the last couple of weeks, so you're stuck with me today. That's the bad news. The good news is we've got a lot of really cool stuff lined up, a couple of really exciting guest appearances that we're currently working on finalizing. We'll tell you more about that in the coming weeks, but normal operations will resume as of next episode. For this one, you're stuck with me. So hope that's okay. Hope you enjoy it anyway. Hope maybe we learn something together, and let's get started. Hello, and welcome to Lexitecture, a podcast about word origins and histories. My name is Ryan, and in each episode, my friend Amy and I present a new word to each other and you, delving into its past, uncovering its secrets, and discovering that even the most basic, unassuming word can offer up precious truth nuggets of wordy trivia gold. If that sounds like the show for you, it probably is, so tell your friends and come along for the ride. Today's episode, temperature. So the word I've chosen for this episode is temperature. And a lot of times when we're choosing the words to do for this show, I don't know about Amy, I can't speak for her process, but for me, it's a lot of the time I think of a word or I think of a connection or one word reminds me of another one and I kind of go, why are those two similar or are those two connected at all? Because they don't seem very connected. In this particular case, I was writing the word temperament and the red squiggly line came up to say that I had done it wrong. One of my chronic spelling Achilles heels is the word temperament because I constantly forget that there's an A in it. I constantly spell it just Temperament instead of Temperament. And so when that red squiggly line came up, I went, oh, crap. Okay, respell it, put the A in there. And then as I'm looking at it, for some reason, it, for the first time, I think, tweaked to me that it's related possibly to temperature. And I was like, well, how does that work? Where does that connection come in? Where did that fork in the road happen to split those two things off? So that's what got me started on temperature. Just to start at the beginning, where it's a good place to start, the top definition on dictionary.com for temperature, as we all know, I'll just read it for you. Quote, a measure of the warmth or coldness of an object or substance with reference to some standard value. The temperature of two systems is the same when the systems are in thermal equilibrium. I don't know why they put that last part in, but that's the definition according to dictionary.com. Just the hotness or coldness of a thing or a person. And so I was wondering how those two things related. As it turns out, the first usage in the OED of temperature in the modern sense of how hot or cold something is, isn't until 1670, but we'll get there. The earliest usage of temperature in that form in English, according to the OED, is back in the 1530s. And Edam Online's characterization for this is the fact of being tempered, or proper proportion. And that's fairly similar to what the OED has for that, in that sense of the word. And that's in the early 1500s. Another early usage of the word that the OED talks about is the noun form of the verb to temper. So you think same relationship as mix is to mixture. You mix something, you end up with a mixture. You temper something, you end up with a temperature of a thing. It sounds weirder than it looks. When you look at it on paper, you go, oh, of course, those are the same things. It's the same format. You just add the TURE on the end of it, and you're good. It's hard to get our ears around that because it sounds so foreign because nobody ever uses it that way. The sentence that the OED has, in fact, has mixture and temperature in it, in the correct mixture and the correct temperature, which sounds a lot better, but still just a little bit off in the sense of it from what it originally meant, which is not surprising because that was 600 years ago, 500 years ago. Don't email me. I get it. Another early use of temperature that's related, again, to temper is, quote, due measure and proportion in action, speech, thought, etc. And so that was sort of like the temperature of a thing was less important than the temperature of a person, and the temperature of a person was not 37 degrees or whatever it is in Fahrenheit, the standard temperature is, but it was their nature and their character, or more than that, their presentation. You have a correct temperature if you're outside in public and you adopt your the speech that's appropriate or the attitude that's appropriate for the setting that you're in. Another related use in the early to mid 1500s was to simply mean a middle condition, or a mean between opposites. Something that wasn't, just middle of the road, wasn't extreme on either end of any particular spectrum or scale. And then we get to, again, in the late 1600s, you get temperature meaning the hotness or coldness of a thing. But as early as 1539, again, going right back to the earliest recorded and written usages of this word, there's a sense that it's sort of slightly similar to the way you use it today, but it's not as restricted simply to heat or cold, warmth or coldness of a thing. The way the OED cites it from the early work that I didn't write down was to talk about, quote, the character or nature of a substance as supposed to be determined by the proportions of the four qualities, hot or cold, dry or moist. So it was almost like the humidity and temperature, what we call temperature now, was the temperature in this sense then. So a much more holistic analysis of a thing, object, or person. But it wasn't until the 1670s that it became kind of narrowed down and calcified to mean just what we mean today. And it's kind of impressive that it's lasted 3.5 centuries in its current form, just meaning hot or cold, which is kind of neat. Etymologically, the path is pretty straightforward up to a point. I guess back to a point, because we're working backwards. So temperature comes from the verb temper, and which comes from the Old English. In Old English, it was temprian, temprian. Wow, me speaking spellings today is not working for some reason. That was just, quote, to moderate, bring to a proper or suitable state, to modify some excessive quality. And so that was the verb to temper. And so that is where, when you hear about tempered steel, process of tempering in metallurgy is to make something hot and then quickly cold a couple of times, like repeatedly, so as to decrease the hardness of a thing and increase its flexibility and durability. So it makes it stronger by reducing the hardness, which makes it less brittle, and that increases the overall durability. So you're tempering its hardness and brittleness by bringing it more into equilibrium, bringing the durability up. So that's pretty straightforward, and that's where that comes from at that point in Old English. In turn, the Old English temprian came from the Latin temperare, and the transitive form of temperare was to mix correctly, regulate, rule, govern, or manage. And so you still get that kind of sense of bringing the two sides into equilibrium, reducing the brittleness and hardness, raising the flexibility and durability of metal, or modifying your speech and language to suit the appropriate venue or whatever, picking the register and choosing how you act and stuff. So all these things make sense in the earliest forms of temperature. They don't really hugely relate to our specific usage of it now, but you can kind of get the sense. You can follow the path so far to that. Beyond temperare, there doesn't seem to be much consensus. The Edom Online has a couple of suggestions. The OED has a couple other suggestions, most of those involving French origins and French coming through as well and influencing semantically how we have come to understand temperature to be. Edom Online draws a link to tempus, the Latin meaning time or season, so where we would get things like temporal or temporary. It acknowledges that requires a semantic shift to get there. It doesn't seem to have a huge amount of evidence supporting that shift, that's specifically the transition that happened. If someone out there knows more about this and is thinking, yes, there's exactly this piece of evidence that links these two, we would love to hear it. Email words@lexitecture.com, drop us a line on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you want, because I stand to be corrected. But from where I'm sitting, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of hard evidence that that's where that comes from. I kind of like it because the root of tempus was to sort of stretch, which is another one of these interesting analogical semantic shifts where to stretch something as a verb and a stretch of something as a noun coalesces to make things make sense. So tempus meaning time or season, like a stretch of time, a span of time. The idea of shifting from a stretch to a measure kind of makes sense, and then measurement would be required in order for you to temper something, is you have to measure how in excess one thing is compared to the other, and that's how you can bring them into equilibrium. So there's a way to do it, whether it's folk etymology or not. Regular listeners will know that we love our folk etymology around here, so I don't particularly care one way or the other. But it's an interesting thing to think about, but there doesn't seem to be any really clear, well-marked path to get back to that point. If you did, you'd end up at the pi root 10, which is related to tense and tenterhooks, and again, temporary, and all these other abstinence, abstain from something. There's all these interesting cognates that you get into, if you can get that far, if you're comfortable going that far back. Yeah, so that's a brief rundown through temperature. That's it for another episode of Lexitecture. If you like what you've heard, please spread the words. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook by searching Lexitecture, Lexitecture, and find us on our website at lexitecture.com. We also love hearing from you, so if you've got a word you'd like us to look into, a tasty bit of trivia to share, or anything else you'd like to tell us, drop us a line at words@lexitecture.com. Talk to you next time. Bye.